The three Alpha Kings stood before me, their combined pheromones suffocating, their golden eyes glowing with fury. I couldn't speak, couldn't scream, couldn't beg. My voice had been stolen years ago, leaving me defenseless in a world ruled by alphas who demanded obedience through words I could never give. So when the eldest brother grabbed my trembling hand and forced a pen into my palm, I wrote the only truth I had left. I'm scared. The ink barely dried before the city erupted in flames. Buildings crumbled, screams echoed through the night, and the scent of smoke mixed with cedar and gunpowder. They burned it all down. For me, because I was afraid. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Where train fell hard against the windows of the abandoned chapel where I had been hiding for 3 days. The world outside had become something unrecognizable, a war zone between the old regime and the three brothers who had seized control of the kingdom in a single bloody night. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, clutching the thin blanket around my shoulders, trying to make myself as small as possible. My blonde hair hung limp and dirty around my face, tangled from days without proper care. I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. The small loaf of bread I'd stolen from a bakery 2 nights ago was long gone, and my stomach twisted painfully with hunger. But hunger was familiar. Hunger I could survive. What terrified me was the sound of boots echoing through the empty streets outside, the patrols searching house by house, dear building by building. They were looking for survivors. They were looking for me. I was 22 years old, and I had been mute since the age of 6. The fever that swept through the lower districts that year took my mother, my father, and my voice. I woke up in a charity hospital 3 weeks later, alive but forever silent. The doctors said the trauma had damaged something in my throat, something that could never be repaired. I learned to communicate through gestures, through writing when I could find paper and ink, through the expressions on my face that most people ignored anyway. Omegas were already considered second-class citizens in the kingdom. Mute Omegas were invisible. We existed in the margins, doing the work no one else wanted, living in the spaces no one else noticed. I'd survived by cleaning the floors of the royal palace, scrubbing the marble hallways in the dead of night when the nobility slept, disappearing before dawn like a ghost who was never meant to be seen. But 3 months ago, everything changed. The old king died suddenly, poison some whispered, and his 3 sons refused to divide the throne. Instead of fighting each other, they formed an alliance that shocked the entire kingdom. The Triplet Alpha Kings. Kieran, the eldest, with black hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes like molten gold. He was strategic, calculating, the one who planned every move 3 steps ahead. Dante, the middle brother, equally dark-haired but with a scar running from his left eyebrow to his cheek, a reminder of the assassination attempt he survived at 16. He was the enforcer, but the one who turned plans into action, who made examples of anyone who dared defy them. And then there was Ashton, the youngest, whose black hair was always slightly disheveled, whose golden eyes held a warmth the other 2 lacked, but whose cruelty when provoked surpassed them both. Together they were unstoppable. Together they had taken the throne by force and declared a new era, one where power would be consolidated, where the noble houses would bow or burn, where Omegas would be registered, tracked, and controlled like livestock. The registration decree came 2 months after their coronation. Every Omega in the kingdom was required to present themselves to the palace for examination, classification, and assignment. Dominant Omegas would be placed in service roles, or submissive Omegas would be sent to breeding facilities to replenish the population decimated by years of war and plague. There were no exceptions. Refusal meant execution. I knew what assignment awaited me. A mute Omega with no family, no connections, no value beyond my body. I would be sent to the facilities paired with whichever alpha paid the highest price for access, used until I broke or died. So I did the only thing I could. I ran. I stopped going to the palace. I hid in the abandoned districts, moving from building to building, surviving on scraps and rainwater. For 2 months I stayed invisible, and then they started burning the city. It began in the eastern district, the poorest part of the capital where those who refused registration had gathered in secret. The Triplet Kings sent their soldiers to surround the entire neighborhood at dawn. They gave the residents 1 hour to turn over any unregistered Omegas. When the hour passed and no one came forward, Dante himself set the fires. The flames consumed everything. Homes, markets, temples, everything except the people who fled screaming into the streets where soldiers waited to capture them. The message was clear. Obey or watch everything you love turn to ash. The burning spread. District by district, neighborhood by neighborhood. They were methodical, thorough, terrifying, and I kept running, until 3 nights ago when I ran out of places to hide. I'd been sleeping in an old grain warehouse near the river when the patrols found me. I woke to the sound of boots on wooden floors, to the sharp commands of soldiers sweeping the building. I barely had time to grab my blanket before I bolted through the back exit, my bare feet slapping against the wet cobblestones as I ran through the darkness. They chased me for 6 blocks. I could hear them shouting behind me, their heavy footsteps gaining ground. My lungs burned, my legs trembled with exhaustion, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I turned a corner and saw the chapel, its doors hanging open, and I dove inside just as a hand grabbed for my blanket. The fabric tore, but I kept moving deeper into the building, through the nave and into the catacombs beneath, where the old priests used to bury the dead. I hid in the darkness for hours, listening to the soldiers search above me, waiting for them to drag me out. But they never found the entrance to the catacombs. Eventually they left, and I stayed, too terrified to move. Too exhausted to run anymore. That was 3 days ago. Now I sat in the same darkness, my body weak from hunger, my mind fracturing from fear and isolation. I had nothing left, no food, no water, no plan. I was going to die here in the darkness, alone and silent, just as I had lived. The thought should have scared me, but instead I felt only a strange emptiness, a resignation that came from knowing there was no escape. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the heavy boots of soldiers, but something quieter, more deliberate. 3 sets of footsteps moving in perfect synchronization. My heart stopped. I pressed myself harder against the wall, trying to disappear into the stone itself. The footsteps grew closer, closer, until they stopped directly above where I was hiding. A voice echoed through the catacombs. Deep and commanding and unmistakably Kieran. We know you are down there. Come out now and we will be merciful. Refuse and we will bury you in the rubble when we collapse this building. Silence. My entire body trembled. They had found me. After months of running, of hiding, of surviving, they had finally found me. A second voice, Dante, rougher and edged with impatience. You have 60 seconds to show yourself. 59. 58. He was counting down. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen, paralyzed by terror so complete it felt like drowning. 50. 49. 48. The third voice, Ashton, softer but no less dangerous. Little Omega, we are not known for our patience. If we have to come down there and drag you out, what happens next will not be pleasant. 30. And 29. And 28. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The countdown continued, relentless, echoing through the catacombs like the ticking of a clock counting down to my execution. 10. 9. 8. I moved. My legs shook so badly I nearly collapsed as I stumbled toward the entrance of the catacombs, my hands outstretched in the darkness to keep from falling. 3. 2. 1. I emerged into the chapel just as Dante finished counting. The 3 of them stood in the center of the nave, backlit by the dim light filtering through the broken stained glass windows. They were even more terrifying in person than I had imagined. Tall, broad-shouldered, their black hair catching the faint light, their golden eyes glowing in the shadows. They wore matching dark coats embroidered with the royal crest, their posture radiating authority and barely restrained violence. Kieran stood in the center, his expression unreadable. Dante stood to his right, arms crossed, his scarred face twisted into something between amusement and disgust. Ashton stood to the left, his head tilted slightly as he studied me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stood before them in my torn clothes, my dirty blonde hair falling into my eyes, my bare feet bleeding from running through the streets. I must have looked like a corpse, pale and skeletal and half dead already. Kieran spoke first, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. Your name. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. I tried again, forcing air through my throat, but it was useless. It had always been useless. Dante stepped forward, impatience flashing across his face. And he asked you a question. Answer him. I shook my head desperately, my hands fumbling to make the sign for mute, but my fingers trembled so badly I couldn't form the gesture properly. Ashton moved then, faster than I expected, crossing the distance between us in the 3 strides. He grabbed my wrist, his grip like iron, and yanked my hand up between us. His golden eyes burned into mine. You will answer when spoken to. I tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I shook my head again, my mouth opening and closing uselessly. Dante laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the chapel. The little Omega is broken, can't even speak. What use is something that can't obey commands? Kieran stepped closer, his gaze never leaving my face. He studied me the way one might study an insect under glass. Answer with detached curiosity and faint disdain. If you cannot speak, then write. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather journal and a pen. He placed them in Ashton's hand. Ashton released my wrist and shoved the journal up against my chest. Write your name, now. I took the journal with shaking hands, barely able to hold the pen. My vision blurred from tears, but I managed to scrawl 4 letters across the page. Elias. Kieran took the journal from me and read the name aloud. Elias. No family name, no house affiliation. You are unregistered. I nodded, my chest tight with fear. Dante circled me slowly, his boots echoing against the stone floor. 2 months we have been hunting unregistered Omegas. 2 months of burning districts, executing resistors, making examples of those who thought they could defy us. And here you are, a mute, nameless, worthless Omega who thought he could hide forever. Ashton grabbed my chin, forcing my head up to meet his gaze. Do you know what we do to those who defy our laws? I couldn't answer. I could barely breathe. His thumb pressed against my jaw, just hard enough to hurt. We make them disappear. Completely. No trial, no mercy, no memory. They simply cease to exist. He released me suddenly, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling. Kieran caught my arm, steadying me with surprising gentleness. But you are different, he said quietly. You did not defy us out of rebellion. You ran because you were afraid. His golden eyes searched mine. Am I correct? I nodded frantically, relief flooding through me, even as terror still gripped my heart. He gestured to the journal, still clutched in my hand. Then write it. Write why you ran. Or write what you're feeling right now. My hands shook as I opened the journal again. The pen felt impossibly heavy. But I wrote, my handwriting jagged and desperate. I'm scared. The 2 words sat on the page, stark and honest and completely vulnerable. Kieran took the journal and read them aloud. I'm scared. Silence fell over the chapel. The 3 brothers looked at each other, some unspoken communication in passing between them. Then Dante laughed again, but this time the sound was different, darker, edged with something I couldn't identify. Scared, he repeated, as you should be. Kieran closed the journal carefully and handed it back to me. You will come with us. You will be registered. You will be examined. And then we will decide what to do with you. It was not a request. It was a command. Ashton stepped forward and grabbed my arm again. His grip firm but not cruel. Move. I had no choice. I followed them out of the chapel and into the rain-soaked streets where a black carriage waited, flanked by armed guards. Dante opened the door and gestured for me to enter. I climbed inside on trembling legs, my wet clothes clinging to my skin, my entire body shaking from cold and fear. The 3 brothers climbed in after me, filling the small space with their presence, their scent, cedar and smoke, and something darker, more primal, that made my Omega instinct scream at me to submit. The carriage began to move. I sat pressed against the far corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. Kieran sat directly across from me, his golden eyes never leaving my face. Ashton sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Dante sat beside Kieran, his scarred face half hidden in shadow. No one spoke. The silence was suffocating. I stared at my hands, at the journal still clutched between my fingers, at the words I had written. I'm scared. It was the truth. But it was also the moment everything changed. Because when we arrived at the palace and I was dragged before the registration council, when the chief examiner declared me a high-grade submissive Omega suitable for royal breeding, when the 3 brothers exchanged another one of those unspoken looks, I realized something that made my blood run cold. They had not brought me here to register me. They had brought me here to claim me. The registration chamber was a vast room lined with marble columns and filled with the cold light of dawn filtering through high windows. A long table sat at the center where the council members waited, dressed in formal robes embroidered with the royal Criterion crest. Guards stood at every exit. There was no escape. I was led to the center of the room and forced to stand before the council, while the chief examiner, an older alpha with silver hair and sharp eyes, circled me slowly. He did not touch me, but his gaze felt invasive, cataloging every detail of my body, my scent, my posture. After several long minutes, he returned to the table and wrote something in a large ledger. His voice was clinical, detached. Omega designation Elias. No family name. Approximately 22 years of age. Blonde hair, blue eyes, mute, unregistered for 2 months following the royal decree. Physical examination shows signs of malnutrition and stress, but overall health is acceptable. Where scent profile indicates high-grade submissive omega with strong bonding potential. Recommendation: immediate assignment to royal breeding program under direct supervision of the crown. The words landed like stones. I felt my knees weaken, but the guard behind me grabbed my arm to keep me upright. Kieran stepped forward from where he had been standing with his brothers near the entrance. The council members immediately fell silent, their heads bowing in deference. Kieran's voice cut through the room like a blade. We will not be assigning this omega to the breeding program. The chief examiner looked up sharply, confusion flickering across his face. Your Majesty, the protocol clearly states that all high-grade submissive omegas must be... Kieran interrupted him with a single raised hand. We are aware of the protocol. We wrote it. And we are now making an exception. This omega will remain under our personal custody. The room erupted in whispers. The council members exchanged nervous glances. The chief examiner straightened, his tone carefully respectful, but edged with concern. Your Majesty, with all due respect, personal custody of an unregistered omega who has defied the law for 2 months sets a dangerous precedent if word spreads that the crown is showing leniency. Dante stepped forward, his scarred face twisted into a smile that promised violence. Are you questioning our decision? The chief examiner paled. No, Your Majesty. I would never. Then note it in the ledger, Dante said coldly. This omega belongs to us. No one else touches him, no one else assigns him, no one else makes decisions regarding his fate. Is that clear? And the chief examiner nodded quickly and made the notation, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote, It is done, Your Majesty. Ashton moved to my side, his hand wrapping around my upper arm in a grip that was possessive rather than restraining. Let's go. I was led out of the chamber in a daze, barely able to process what had just happened. The brothers did not speak as we walked through the palace corridors, past guards who bowed as we passed, past servants who averted their eyes. We climbed a grand staircase and entered a wing of the palace I had only ever seen from a distance, the private quarters reserved for the royal family. Kieran opened a door and gestured for me to enter. This will be your room. I stepped inside and froze. The room was enormous, 10 times the size of any space I had ever slept in. A massive bed draped in dark silk sat against one wall. Heavy curtains framed tall windows that overlooked the city. A fireplace crackled with warmth. There was a desk, a wardrobe, a private bathing room visible through an open doorway. It was a room meant for nobility, not for a mute omega who had been scrubbing floors weeks ago. Ashton released my arm and moved to stand beside the fireplace. Dante closed the door behind us, locking it with a soft click. Kieran crossed his arms and studied me with that same unreadable expression. You will stay here, he said. You will not leave this room without permission. You will not speak to anyone, though I suppose that is not a concern for you. You will obey every command we give you without question. Do you understand? I nodded quickly, my heart pounding. Dante stepped closer, his golden eyes gleaming in the firelight. And if you try to run again, we will not be as merciful as we were today. We will find you. And when we do, we will make sure you never forget what happens to omegas who defy us. Ashton's voice was softer but no less dangerous. You belong to us now, Elias. Your body, your time, your obedience. Everything. I wanted to ask why. Why me? Why this room? Why personal custody instead of the breeding program? But I had no voice to ask, and I doubted they would answer even if I did. Kieran gestured to the desk where a new leather journal and pen had been placed. If you need something, write it there. Someone will check the journal twice a day. If you try to write anything that could be used to contact the outside world or plan an escape, you will be punished. He turned toward the door, and Dante and Ashton followed. Before they left, Kieran glanced back at me one last time. Rest, he said. Tomorrow your training begins. The door closed behind them. I heard the lock turn, and I was alone. I stood in the center of that beautiful, terrifying room, my dirty clothes dripping rainwater into the polished floor, my mind spinning with fear and confusion, and the terrible certainty that my life would never be my own again. I don't know how long I stood there before my legs gave out. I collapsed onto the floor, my back against the bed, my arms wrapped around my knees. The warmth from the fireplace did nothing to chase away the cold that had settled deep in my bones. I was trapped, claimed, owned by 3 alphas who could destroy cities with a word, who ruled through fear and fire, who had chosen me for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. And the worst part, the part that made my stomach twist with shame, was the way my omega instincts responded to them, the way my body had reacted to their scent, to their touch, to their dominance. Even now, alone in this locked room, I could still feel the ghost of Ashton's hand on my arm, Kieran's fingers steadying me, Dante's presence circling me like a predator. My instincts screamed at me to submit, to please, to bond. But my mind, the part of me that had survived 6 years of silence and 2 months of running, that part knew better. These men were dangerous. And I was their prisoner. Eventually exhaustion won. I dragged myself into the bathing room and found everything I needed: soap, clean towels, and a large tub already filled with steaming water as if someone had known I would need it. I stripped off my filthy clothes and sank into the water, letting the heat soak into my aching muscles. I scrubbed my skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the dirt and fear and shame. When I finally climbed out, I wrapped myself in a towel and returned to the bedroom. Someone had entered while I bathed. My torn clothes were gone. In their place, laid carefully across the bed, was a set of clean clothing, soft trousers, and a loose shirt in dark fabric, and undergarments that fit perfectly as if they had been made for me. I dressed slowly, my hands still trembling. The clothes smelled faintly of cedar, the same scent that clung to the brothers. It made my head spin. I climbed into the bed, pulling the heavy blankets over me, and closed my eyes. Or sleep did not come easily. Every time I drifted off, I jolted awake, certain I heard footsteps outside the door, certain they were coming back. But they didn't come that night. Morning arrived with pale sunlight streaming through the windows. I woke to the sound of the lock turning. My heart leapt into my throat as the door opened and a servant entered, an older beta woman carrying a tray of food. She set it on the desk without looking at me, bowed her head, and left without a word. The lock clicked again. I approached the tray cautiously. Bread, cheese, fruit, tea, more food than I had eaten in weeks. My stomach growled painfully. I sat at the desk and ate slowly, forcing myself not to devour everything at once, even though my body screamed for it. Beside the tray, the leather journal sat waiting. I opened it to the first page where I had written my name days ago. On the next page, in elegant handwriting that was not mine, was a message. Your training begins this afternoon. You will be collected at midday. Do not make us wait. There was no signature, but I knew who had written it. Kieran. His handwriting was as controlled and precise as everything else about him. I had no clock, no way to tell time except by the movement of the sun across the sky. I spent the morning pacing the room, my anxiety building with every passing minute. What did training mean? What would they do to me? The question spiraled through my mind until I felt like I might collapse again. When the lock turned at what I assumed was midday, I was standing in the center of the room, my hands clasped in front of me, and trying to appear calm, even though I was falling apart inside. No, Ashton entered alone. He was dressed more casually than yesterday, black trousers and a loose shirt that did nothing to hide the strength in his shoulders and arms. His golden eyes swept over me, taking in my clean clothes, my brushed hair, my trembling posture. "Good," he said. "You're ready." He gestured for me to follow. I obeyed, my bare feet silent against the marble floors as we walked through the palace. We descended several staircases and entered a part of the building I didn't recognize, a wing that felt older, colder, more utilitarian. Ashton stopped in front of a heavy wooden door and pushed it open. Inside was a training room. The walls were lined with weapons, swords, daggers, whips, things I had only seen in the hands of guards. Already in the center of the room stood Kieran and Dante, both dressed similarly to Ashton, both watching the door as we entered. Kieran gestured to a spot on the floor in front of him. "Here. Now." I crossed the room on shaking legs and stood where he indicated. The 3 of them surrounded me, forming a triangle, their combined presence overwhelming. Kieran spoke first, his tone clinical. "You are here because you belong to us. That means you will learn to obey without question, to anticipate our needs, to serve us in whatever capacity we require. Today we begin with the basics." He nodded to Dante, who stepped forward and handed me a small object, a collar. It was made of black leather, simple but sturdy, with a silver ring at the front. My entire body went cold. Dante's voice was rough. "Put it on." I stared at the collar, my hands frozen. Plus, this was it. The moment I truly became property. Not a person, not even a servant, but an object to be owned and controlled. Ashton moved behind me, his breath warm against my ear. Do it now, little Omega, or we will do it for you. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the collar. I lifted it to my throat and fumbled with the buckle, my vision blurring with tears. It took 3 tries before I managed to fasten it. The leather sat snug against my skin, not tight enough to choke, but impossible to ignore. The weight of it, physical and symbolic, made my knees buckle. I sank to the floor, my hands covering my face as silent sobs racked my body. I felt Kieran crouch in front of me. His hand, surprisingly gentle, lifted my chin. Look at me. I forced my eyes open. His golden gaze held mine. You are ours now, Elias. This collar is a reminder of that fact. It will not come off unless we remove it. You will wear it always. Do you understand? I nodded, tears streaming down my face. He wiped one away with his thumb, the gesture so unexpectedly tender it made my chest ache. Good. Now stand. The training continued for hours, and they taught me how to kneel properly, how to lower my eyes in submission, how to present myself when called. Every mistake was corrected immediately, not with violence, but with cold, precise commands that made it clear failure was not an option. By the time Ashton finally said enough, my body was trembling from exhaustion, and my mind was numb. They led me back to my room in silence. Kieran paused at the door. You did well today. Tomorrow will be harder. The door closed, the lock turned, and I collapsed onto the bed. My fingers tracing the edge of the collar around my throat, and wondered how long it would take before I forgot what freedom felt like. Days blurred into weeks. The training continued, relentless and methodical. I learned the hierarchy of their commands, the subtle differences in their tones that indicated displeasure or approval. I learned to serve tea without spilling, to move silently through the palace, to anticipate when they wanted me present and when they wanted me invisible. The collar became a part of me, as familiar as my own skin, and slowly, terrifyingly, I began to adapt. My body learned to crave their approval, to respond to their scent, to find comfort in their presence, even as my mind screamed that this was wrong. One night, a month after I had been brought to the palace, Kieran summoned me to his private study. I entered to find him sitting behind a massive desk covered in maps and documents. He didn't look up immediately. Sit, he said, gesturing to a chair across from him. I obeyed, my hands folded in my lap. He continued reading for several minutes, the silence stretching until I thought I might scream. Finally, he set down the document and looked at me. Do you know why we chose you, Elias? I shook my head. He leaned back in his chair. When we found you in that chapel, you could have lied. You could have written anything in that journal, a false name, a fabricated story, anything to make yourself seem more valuable or less guilty. But you didn't. You wrote the truth. I'm scared. Those 2 words told us everything we needed to know. You are honest, even when honesty makes you vulnerable. That is rare, especially among Omegas who have learned to manipulate to survive. He stood and walked around the desk, leaning against it directly in front of me. We need someone we can trust, Elias. Someone who will not lie to us, who will not betray us, who will serve us without hidden agendas. You are that person, not because you are loyal, but because you are incapable of deception. Your silence makes you honest. I didn't know how to respond. His logic was twisted, but not entirely wrong. I had never learned to lie convincingly because I had no voice to lie with. Kieran reached out and touched the collar around my throat, his fingers tracing the leather. This is not a punishment, he said quietly. This is protection. As long as you wear this, no one in the kingdom will dare harm you. You are under our personal protection. So you belong to us, and we do not allow anyone to touch what is ours. His words should have terrified me. Instead, I felt something else, something dangerous and confusing that made my chest tighten. He noticed. His eyes searched mine. You're beginning to understand, aren't you? I looked away, but he caught my chin, forcing me to meet his gaze again. Say it. Write it. He handed me the journal I now carried everywhere. I opened it with shaking hands and wrote 3 words I'd been trying to deny for weeks. I feel safe. Kieran read the words and smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face from cold and calculating to something almost warm. Good. That is the beginning. He released me and returned to his desk. You may go. I stood on unsteady legs and left the study, my mind reeling. Back in my room, I sat at the desk and stared at the journal, at the words I had written. I feel safe. It was true. Despite everything, despite the collar and the training and the terrifying power they held over me, I felt safer with them than I had ever felt running through the burning city. And that realization scared me more than anything else. The weeks turned into months, and the palace became my entire world. I no longer thought about the city beyond the walls, about the life I had lived before, about freedom. Those concepts felt distant now, like memories from someone else's life. The collar around my throat was as permanent as my silence, a constant reminder of who I belonged to. But strangely, as time passed, the weight of it began to feel less like a burden and more like an anchor, or something that kept me grounded in a world that had always felt too vast and too cruel. The brothers fell into a routine with me, and I learned to navigate the rhythm of their days, as if it were a song only the four of us could hear. Mornings I spent with Kieran in his study, learning to assist with his correspondence, carrying documents, sitting quietly while he worked. The study was my favorite room in the palace, lined floor to ceiling with books that smelled of old leather and ink. Sunlight would stream through the tall windows, catching dust motes in the air, and I would sit in the chair beside his desk, watching his elegant handwriting flow across parchment. He rarely spoke during these hours, but his presence was steady, predictable, almost comforting. Sometimes he would reach out without looking, his hand finding mine, and squeezing gently before returning to his work. It was such a small gesture, but it made my chest warm every time. Afternoons belonged to Dante, who trained me in physical tasks, strengthening my body so I could carry heavier trays, stand for longer periods, move with grace and precision. He was harder than Kieran, quicker to correct, but he never raised his voice and he never struck me. Instead, he would demonstrate movements himself, his scarred face intense with concentration, then watch as I mimicked him. When I did well, he would nod once, a barely perceptible acknowledgement that somehow meant more than elaborate praise. When I stumbled, he would simply say again and wait patiently for me and to try once more. Evenings I spent with Ashton, who taught me the subtler aspects of service, reading their moods, anticipating their needs before they voiced them, understanding the unspoken language of their household. Ashton was the most tactile of the three, always finding reasons to touch me, a hand on my shoulder, fingers brushing my cheek, his arm around my waist as he guided me through the palace corridors. At first it had made me nervous, but I grew to crave those casual touches, the warmth of his body close to mine, the cedar scent that clung to his clothes. At night I returned to my room alone, and that solitude became increasingly difficult to bear. They had never touched me beyond the necessary, a hand on my arm when guiding me, fingers lifting my chin when they wanted my attention, the brush of their presence as they moved past me in corridors. I told myself I was relieved by this restraint. I told myself I didn't want more, or that the distance between us was safer, easier, but my omega instincts grew stronger with every passing day, responding to their scent like flowers turning toward sunlight, craving their approval with an intensity that frightened me, aching for a closeness they withheld deliberately. My body would react to them in ways I couldn't control. When Kieran stood too close, my pulse would quicken. When Dante's hand lingered on my waist, my skin would flush hot. When Ashton whispered instructions in my ear, I would shiver despite the warmth of the room. I began to understand that this was part of the training too, perhaps the most important part. They were teaching me to want them, to need them, building the desire slowly and carefully so that when they finally claimed me it would be complete, willing, inevitable. And it was working. And every night I lay in that enormous bed alone, the sheets smelling faintly of cedar, and I ached for them in ways I had no words to express, even if I could speak. 3 months after I had been brought to the palace, everything shifted in a single night. It started with a formal dinner, the kind of grand affair that happened only a few times each year when visiting dignitaries needed to be impressed and alliances needed to be forged over wine and carefully prepared food. I'd served at meals before, but always for the three brothers alone, and never with guests present, never in the grand dining hall where chandeliers dripped crystal light onto tables laden with silver and gold. That evening the hall was filled with nobility from across the kingdom. Alphas and betas dressed in their finest silks and velvets. Jewels glittering at throats and wrists gathered to discuss trade agreements and military alliances that would shape the future of the realm. I was instructed to serve alongside the other Omega servants, to blend into the background, to be invisible, as I had always been before the brothers claimed me. But the collar around my throat made invisibility impossible. The moment I entered the hall with the first tray of wine, balancing the heavy silver vessel carefully in both hands, eyes turned toward me from every direction. I felt the weight of their stares like physical touches, heard the whispers that followed me from table to table. The collar around my throat marked me as a property of the crown, and that made me an object of fascination and envy among the gathered nobles. Some looked with curiosity, others with barely concealed lust, a few with outright resentment. I kept my head down and, moving from guest to guest with practiced efficiency, pouring wine with steady hands despite the anxiety clawing at my chest. The training with Dante had taught me how to carry heavy objects without trembling, how to move with grace even when my heart pounded with fear. I made it through the first course without incident, retreating to the kitchens to collect the next round of wine, allowing myself a moment to breathe deeply and steady my nerves. But my relief was short-lived. Everything was fine until I reached a table near the back where a group of visiting alphas sat, merchants from the northern territories known for their wealth and their cruelty toward omegas. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and cold eyes, grabbed my wrist as I poured his wine. The grip was tight, possessive, deliberate. He pulled me closer, his voice loud enough to carry across several nearby tables. This one is exquisite. Mute, I hear. How much are the kings asking for a night with their pet? Laughter erupted around the table, harsh and mocking. My heart stopped. The wine bottle trembled in my free hand. I tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened, his fingers digging into my wrist hard enough to bruise. Another alpha leaned forward, grinning like a wolf that had cornered prey. Probably not for sale. The kings are known to be possessive of their toys, but perhaps if we offer enough gold? The first alpha ran his free hand along my arm, his touch making my skin crawl, making bile rise in my throat. What do you say, pretty Omega? Would you like to serve real alphas for a change? The room had gone quiet. Conversations dying mid-sentence as nobles turned to watch. I could feel everyone staring, some with shock, others with cruel amusement waiting to see what would happen. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the wine bottle. And then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, terrifyingly calm. Dante crossed the hall in seconds, his black coat billowing behind him, his scarred face twisted into something that promised violence and pain. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed the alpha's wrist, the one gripping me, and twisted it backward with brutal efficiency until I heard bone crack like dry wood snapping. The alpha screamed, a high-pitched sound of agony and shock, releasing me instantly. Dante's voice was ice, cold and lethal and utterly devoid of mercy. You touched what belongs to us. The alpha paled, already clutching his broken wrist to his chest, blood draining from his face. Your Majesty, I meant no disrespect. I was simply making conversation. I didn't mean. Dante cut him off by slamming the man's face into the table with enough force to shatter his nose. Blood splattered across the white tablecloth, across the fine china, across the horrified faces of the alphas sitting nearby. The hall erupted in chaos, guests rising from their seats, some backing away toward the exits, others frozen in shock and morbid fascination. Kieran appeared at the head of the hall as if summoned by the violence itself, his golden eyes blazing with fury, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. Everyone sit down. Now. The command was absolute, carrying the full weight of royal authority and alpha dominance. Every person in the room obeyed instantly, sinking back into their chairs, some trembling, all silent. Ashton moved to my side with fluid grace, his hand gentle on my shoulder, despite the rage I could feel radiating from him through the bond we didn't yet fully share. He guided me away from the table, away from the blood and the broken alpha whimpering on the floor. Dante hauled the bleeding man to his feet and dragged him to the center of the hall where Kieran waited, a king standing in judgment. Kieran's golden eyes swept over the room, taking in every face, every expression, his own face carved from stone and shadow. Let this serve as a reminder, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. The Omega wearing our collar is untouchable. Any attempt to claim him, to harm him, or to so much as speak to him without our explicit permission will result in immediate execution. No trial, no mercy, no exceptions. He gestured to the other guards standing at the doors, soldiers who had served the crown for years and knew better than to hesitate. Remove this man from the palace. See that he never returns to the capital. If he is found within city walls after tonight, kill him. The guards moved immediately, dragging the sobbing, blood-soaked alpha out of the hall, his broken wrist dangling uselessly, his pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. Kieran turned back to the assembled nobles, his expression returning to cold neutrality. Enjoy your meal. The dinner continued in tense, suffocating silence. No one dared speak above a whisper. No one dared look at me. Ashton led me out of the hall and back to my room. his hand never leaving my shoulder, his presence solid and protective. Once inside, he locked the door and cupped my face gently in both hands, his golden eyes searching mine with genuine concern. "Are you hurt? Did he harm you?" I shook my head quickly, my hands trembling as I signed no, the gesture shaky but clear. Ashton's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. "He should not have touched you. That was unforgivable. We should have anticipated this. Should have kept you away from those northern bastards." He released me and paced the room, anger radiating from him in waves so strong I could almost see them. When he finally stopped, he turned back to me, his expression softer but no less intense. "You are ours, Elias. No one else has a right to touch you. Do you understand that?" "Do you truly understand what it means to wear our collar?" I nodded, my chest tight with emotion I couldn't name, something between gratitude and fear and a dangerous warmth that made my Omega instincts sing. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to trace the collar around my throat with reverent fingers. "We have been patient with you. We wanted you to adjust, to feel safe, to come to us willingly rather than through force. But tonight proved that we can no longer wait. Others see your collar and think it is only symbolic, a pretty ornament with no real meaning. They need to understand that you are claimed in every way that matters, that you belong to us in body, in scent, in bond." My breath caught. His meaning was clear, unmistakable. Tonight everything would change. He left without another word, locking the door behind him with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the sudden silence. I sank onto the bed, my mind racing, my body trembling. I had known this moment would come eventually, but I wasn't ready. I would never be ready. Hours passed in agonizing slowness. The sun set. Darkness filled the room like water filling a vessel, and still I sat frozen on the edge of the bed, waiting, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lock turned with a soft metallic sound. All three of them entered together, moving with that same synchronized grace that had terrified me the first time I saw them in the chapel. They closed the door and stood before me, their combined presence overwhelming, their scent filling the room until I could barely breathe. Kieran spoke first, and his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "Stand." I obeyed on trembling legs, my knees threatening to give out beneath me. He crossed to me in 2 strides and placed his hands on my shoulders, his touch firm but not rough. "We are going to claim you tonight, Elias, all 3 of us. You will bond with us completely, irrevocably. There will be no going back after this, no undoing what we do. Do you understand?" I nodded, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might shatter my ribs. Dante moved behind me, his hand settling on my waist, his presence solid and grounding. "You are afraid. That is natural, expected even. But we will not hurt you. We will never hurt you. This is not a punishment or a violation. This is a claiming, a bond, a promise that you will never be alone again." Ashton stepped in front of me, his fingers tilting my chin up so I had to meet his golden gaze. "You are ours. You have always been ours from the moment we found you in that chapel. Tonight we simply make it permanent, make it real in a way the collar alone cannot." What followed was overwhelming in its intensity, terrifying in its completeness, and strangely gentle despite the power they wielded over me. They moved together as if they had planned every moment, every touch designed to ease my fear rather than amplify it, to build warmth rather than simply take what they wanted. Kieran's hands were steady and careful, mapping every inch of my skin as if committing it to memory. Dante's strength was tempered with surprising tenderness, his scarred hands reverent where I expected them to be rough. Ashton whispered reassurances against my skin, or his voice grounding me when the sensations became too much, when I thought I might shatter from the intensity. They claimed me one by one, marking me with their scent, their touch, their bond, each claiming building on the last until I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. By the time the sun rose, painting the room in shades of gold and rose, I was no longer just their property. I was their mate, bonded to all 3 in a way that rewrote something fundamental in my soul. The bond settled into my chest like roots sinking deep into fertile soil, connecting me to all 3 of them in a way that felt both foreign and inevitable, uncomfortable and right. I could feel their emotions now, faint but present, a constant hum beneath my own thoughts like a river flowing underground, and they could feel mine. My lingering fear transforming slowly into trust, my isolation giving way to belonging. My Omega instincts, which had been screaming at me for months to submit, to bond, to claim and be claimed, finally quieted into satisfied contentment. I was theirs. They were mine. And something that had been broken inside me for as long as I could remember it began tentatively to heal. The days after the bonding were strange and disorienting in the best possible way. The brothers became more present in my life, seeking me out not just for service, but for companionship, for the simple pleasure of being near me. Kieran would pull me onto his lap while he worked, one arm wrapped around my waist as he read documents with his free-handed, occasionally pressing a kiss to my temple or my hair, his touch absent-minded but constant. Dante would find me in the gardens where I liked to walk in the afternoons and fall into step beside me in comfortable silence, his hand resting possessively on my lower back, his presence protective without being smothering. Ashton would appear in my room at night and hold me until I fell asleep, his steady breathing and the solid warmth of his body lulling me into a peace I had never known, a safety that felt absolute. The bond grew stronger with every passing day, deepening from a faint hum to a constant presence, a connection that let me anticipate their needs before they voiced them, that let me understand the subtle shifts in their moods, that let me feel their presence even when they were far from me in distant parts of the palace, and they in turn became fiercely protective in ways that went beyond what they had shown before. No one in the palace had dared approach me without explicit permission. The servants bowed deeply when I passed. The guards moved aside and lowered their eyes. I was no longer invisible, no longer the mute Omega scrubbing floors in the dead of night. I was the bonded mate of the three most powerful alphas in the kingdom, and that carried weight, commanded respect, demanded deference. But the bond brought complications I hadn't anticipated, changes I wasn't prepared for. 4 months after the claiming, I began to feel different in ways I couldn't quite name. My body ached in strange places, muscles protesting movements that had never bothered me before. My scent changed, becoming sweeter, richer, almost cloying in its intensity. I was constantly exhausted, falling asleep at odd hours, struggling to stay awake through afternoon lessons with Ashton, my eyelids growing heavy no matter how much I slept the night before. And the nausea. Gods, the nausea. Every morning I would wake feeling like my stomach was trying to turn itself inside out, barely making it to the bathing room before losing whatever I had managed to eat the day before. I didn't understand what was happening to me. I thought perhaps I was ill, that some sickness had taken root. But I was too afraid to worry the brothers, too afraid they might think I was weak or defective. So I hid it as best I could, swallowing back bile, forcing myself to eat even when food turned my stomach, pushing through the exhaustion, until one afternoon when I couldn't hide it anymore. I had been organizing documents in Kieran's study, where it is a task I usually enjoyed for its quiet simplicity, when a wave of nausea hit me so hard and so suddenly that I barely made it to the waste bin before my stomach rebelled violently. I knelt on the floor, trembling and sweating, too weak to stand, my vision swimming. That was how Ashton found me when he came looking for me, curled on the cold marble floor of the bathing room adjacent to the study, too nauseous and exhausted to move. His face went pale with fear. He gathered me into his arms without a word and carried me to my bed, his movements careful, despite the panic I could feel radiating through the bond. He called for their palace physicians immediately, his voice sharp with command. The examination was thorough and uncomfortable. The physician, an older beta woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, checked my pulse. Art examined my eyes and tongue, pressed carefully on my stomach, asked questions I answered by writing shakily in my journal. When it was over, she stepped back and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that confused me. When she spoke, her words changed everything. Your Majesty, your Omega is carrying a child, approximately 10 weeks along based on the signs and symptoms. Congratulations. The room went silent. Ashton stared at the physician, as if she had spoken in a language he didn't understand. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Repeat that, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The physician's smile widened. Your Omega is pregnant, Your Majesty. The child is healthy and developing well. All the symptoms, the nausea, the exhaustion, the changes in scent, they are perfectly normal for this stage. Ashton's face transformed in an instant, her shock giving way to something fierce and protective and almost frightening in its intensity, joy so pure it made my chest ache. He dismissed the physician with a distracted wave and immediately gathered me into his arms, his hands trembling as they settled over my still, flat stomach. Ours, he whispered, his voice breaking. You're carrying our child. Our child! Kieran and Dante arrived within minutes, the bond alerting them that something significant had happened, something that had shaken Ashton to his core. When Ashton told them, barely able to get the words out through his overwhelming emotion, their reactions were immediate and all-consuming. Kieran pulled me into an embrace so tight I could barely breathe. His usually controlled voice rough with emotion. "You are giving us an heir. A child. Our child." Dante pressed his forehead to mine, his golden eyes bright with unshed tears, his scarred hands cupping my face with heartbreaking gentleness. "Nothing will ever harm you or this child. I swear it on my life, on my crown, on everything I am." From that moment on, their protectiveness reached new and sometimes absurd extremes. I was no longer allowed to lift anything heavier than a teacup. Servants were assigned to follow me everywhere, ensuring I never walked alone, never climbed stairs without assistance, never wanted for anything before I could even think to ask. The brothers rearranged their entire schedules to ensure one of them was always with me, always within reach. Kieran moved his work into my room so he could watch over me while I rested, his desk positioned where he could see me at all times. Dante personally supervised every meal, tasting everything first to ensure it was safe, ensuring I ate enough to nourish both myself and the growing child. Ashton barely slept, constantly checking on me throughout the night, his hand resting on my stomach as if protecting the child even before it was born, even when it was barely more than a flutter of movement. The pregnancy progressed quickly, my body changing in ways that fascinated and terrified me. My stomach rounded visibly by the 3rd month, swelling with undeniable proof of the life growing inside me. The child was strong, active, constantly moving. I could feel it kicking, pressing against my hand when I touched my belly, responding to voices and touched with enthusiastic movements that sometimes took my breath away. The brothers were endlessly fascinated, taking turns speaking to the unborn child, their deep voices vibrating through my skin in ways that made the baby kick even harder. Kieran would read aloud from books about the kingdom's history, educating the child even in the womb, preparing it for the legacy it would inherit. Dante would tell stories of great battles and hard-won victories, his tone softening whenever the child kicked in response to his voice. Ashton would sing old lullabies his own mother had sung to him, his voice surprisingly gentle and sweet, his hand never leaving my stomach. I had never imagined this life for myself. 6 months ago, I had been a mute omega running through burning streets, convinced I would die alone and forgotten in some dark corner. Now I was carrying the future heir to the throne, bonded to 3 alphas who would burn the world to keep me safe. I'm living in a palace where I was cherished rather than discarded. It felt like a dream I was terrified of waking from, a happiness too fragile to trust, too perfect to be real. But the dream was real, and it was mine. 6 months into my pregnancy, a new threat emerged that tested everything we had built. A rebellion had been growing in the southern territories for months, nobles who refused to accept the brothers' rule, who wanted to return to the old ways, where power was divided among competing houses and omegas were properties without protection or rights. The brothers had been monitoring the situation, but had not considered it a serious threat, dismissing the rebels as disorganized and poorly funded. That assessment proved catastrophically wrong the night assassins infiltrated the palace. I woke to the sound of breaking glass, then with a crash echoing through my room like thunder. Before I could move, before I could even sit up, Ashton was there, appearing from the shadows as if he had been waiting for this. He dragged me from the bed with urgent hands and pushed me toward the hidden passage behind the wardrobe, a secret exit I hadn't known existed. "Go," he commanded, his voice tight with fear and fury. "Find Kieran. Do not stop for anything. Do not look back. Run." I hesitated, my hand instinctively going to my swollen stomach, fear freezing me in place. "What about you?" I signed frantically. Ashton gripped my shoulders hard enough to bruise, his golden eyes burning into mine with desperate intensity. "Protect our child, Elias. That is all that matters. Run. Now." I ran, my bare feet slapping against cold stone, one hand braced against the wall for balance, with the other cradling my stomach protectively. The passage was narrow and dark, lit only by occasional torches that cast flickering shadows on the walls. I could hear fighting behind me, the clash of steel against steel, shouts of pain and rage, the wet sounds of violence. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The baby kicked frantically inside me, sensing my terror through some primal connection. I wanted to stop, to go back, to help somehow, but I kept moving because Ashton had commanded it, because protecting this child was the only thing that mattered. I emerged in Kieran's study to find him already armed and armored, Dante at his side, both of them prepared for battle. Kieran saw me, and his expression shifted instantly from cold fury to overwhelming relief. He crossed to me in 2 strides and pulled me close, or his hands running over me frantically, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" I shook my head, gasping for breath, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. He turned to Dante, his voice sharp with command. "Get him to the safe room. Now. Do not leave him for any reason." Dante didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He lifted me into his arms despite my size and the weight of my pregnancy, and carried me through corridors I had never seen, descending deep into the bowels of the palace, going down and down, until we reached a reinforced door hidden behind a false wall. He pushed it open and set me down gently inside a small chamber lit by oil lamps. The walls thick stone, the air cool and stale. "This is the last defense," he said, his voice steady despite the violence raging above us. "No one knows this place exists except the three of us and now you. You will be safe here no matter what happens." He pressed a dagger into my hand, the blade sharp and cold, the weight unfamiliar. "If anyone comes through that door who is not one of us, use this. Aim for the throat or the heart. Do not hesitate." Then he was gone, the door slamming shut, the lock engaging with a heavy thud that sounded like a coffin closing. I was alone in the silence, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the baby kicking frantically inside me as if trying to escape, as if sensing the danger even from the safety of my womb. I sank to the floor, my back against the cold stone wall, and the dagger clutched in shaking hands. Time lost all meaning in that dark chamber. I didn't know if minutes or hours passed, if the fighting above had ended, or was still raging. Or all I could do was wait and pray to gods I wasn't sure existed anymore. Then I heard it, footsteps approaching the door, slow and deliberate. I scrambled to my feet, raising the dagger even though my hands trembled so badly I could barely hold it, even though I had no idea how to use it as a weapon. The lock turned with agonizing slowness. The door swung open, and Kieran stepped inside, his face streaked with blood that wasn't his clothes torn and stained, his armor dented but intact. He saw me with the dagger, and his expression softened despite the violence still clinging to him. "It's over," he said simply. "They are all dead, every last one. The rebellion is broken." I dropped the dagger and collapsed into his arms, sobbing silently against his chest, my whole body shaking with relief and residual terror. He held me tightly, in one hand cradling the back of my head, the other resting protectively over my swollen stomach. "You are safe," he murmured against my hair. "You and our child, always safe. I will never let anything harm you." Dante and Ashton appeared moments later, equally blood-stained but alive and whole. They surrounded me, their hands gentle despite the violence still fresh on their skin, despite the blood drying on their faces. We returned to our chambers in silence, the adrenaline fading, exhaustion setting in. Servants cleaned their wounds and brought fresh clothes while I sat on the bed watching them, feeling the bond pulse with their relief and lingering rage and fierce protective love. That night they held me between them on the bed, their bodies forming a protective barrier around me, and the child growing inside me. And I finally understood the full weight of what it meant to be theirs. They would kill for me without hesitation. They would die for me without regret. And I would do the same for them, because that was what family meant, what love meant, what this bond we shared demanded. The final months of my pregnancy passed in a hard-won peace. The rebellion had been crushed so thoroughly, the leaders executed so publicly, that no one dared challenge the brothers' rule again. I grew larger and slower, my body preparing for birth. 8 months in, I went into labor in the dead of night. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Waves of agony that stole my breath. I couldn't scream, but the bond carried my suffering to them, and they came instantly. The labor lasted 12 brutal hours. Kieran held my hand throughout, talking me through each contraction. Dante paced like a caged animal. Ashton stayed at my side, whispering reassurances. And then finally a cry split the air, high and strong and perfect. The midwife placed the baby in my arms. I looked down at golden eyes and black hair and fell instantly, completely in love. "It's a boy," she said, strong and healthy. "We named him Adrian. He became our world." Years passed. Adrian grew bright and curious. The kingdom prospered. And one evening when he was 5, I sat in the garden watching him play. The brothers joined me. The sun set. Adrian asked me to watch his sword routine. We applauded. Ashton asked if I remembered the chapel. I nodded and wrote in my journal. "I'm home now." Dante read it aloud. Ashton kissed my temple. "Yes, you are." We sat as stars appeared. I thought about that terrified Omega, hiding in darkness. About writing, I'm scared. About how fear led me here. The collar was no longer to ownership, it was belonging. Years later, Adrian asked why I wore it. I wrote, because they claimed me when I had nothing, protected me when I was afraid, loved me when I thought I was unlovable. This reminds me I am theirs, and they are mine. Forever.